Hi, thank you for joining me in the Louie file today. All right, if you have a Bible with you, you might want to turn to Galatians chapter 2. We're going to have one verse. We're going to cover a lot of verses today, but we're going to pull it all out of Galatians 2, verse 20, a familiar verse probably to you, which is good. I think I'm going to attempt to look at this. There's four I's primarily. The letter I, capital I, in the Galatians 2:20 verse, and that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to try and look and see what this is really saying, because it sounds like a mystery, it sounds confusing, it may sound contradictory, so we have to look underneath a little bit to see what the Apostle Paul is really saying. So let me just read this verse to you, and then we'll see where it goes. Galatians 2:20 says, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. Wow. This is one verse, I think, that better and maybe more than any other that would sum up the Apostle Paul's theology and his message to the world. So with that being said, I think it's important to look at maybe a little closer, right? So he starts off saying, I have been crucified with Christ. Wow. So this is it right here. When you're dealing with temptation, you have to see yourself as having died. That's what you got to do. You have to see that as true. And of course that's by faith, but this is exactly what God is telling us has taken place by way of the cross. He's saying that not only did Jesus, the man, the single individual, die on that cross that day, but he's saying that we by faith can take his death as our own. And that means that we have died to sin, and we have died to the law, and that we no longer operate according to the course of this world. We have a new life altogether in him. So let's look at a few verses here. Who exactly is this I that was crucified? Well, when we all come into this life, we come into this life in Adam, in sin, dead in our trespasses. So let's look real quick, since we're right here. Galatians, just turn a little bit to your right to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians 2, the Apostle Paul wrote this also, not surprising, and he starts off Ephesians chapter 2 telling us what our problem was. Now he's writing this obviously to the church at Ephesus, so he's writing to believers who this no longer describes them, but it describes exactly who they were. It describes who I was. It describes who you were before you came to Christ. This is a looking underneath the surface of what it means to be lost, what it means to be a sinner. It's not just that you as some independent person have done some bad things and done some good things, but it really is revealing to us that we actually all start out in this life with the wrong spirit in us. And that's what has to die. We have to be separated from this wrong spirit, and that's what the cross does. So Ephesians 2, starting in verse 1, I'm going to read the first three verses here. Ephesians 2:1. And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. Among them we too all formerly lived in the lusts of our flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. So I want to get your attention focused on this, the second verse primarily. It says, you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that's now working in the sons of disobedience. So we all start off living just like the rest of the world, which is in disobedience and rebellion to God. But why are we in rebellion to God? Well, this answers the question. It's because we're walking and operating according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that's now working in the sons of disobedience. I don't think there's any argument that the prince of the power of the air is the enemy. We could just go right ahead and call it Satan. According to the scriptures, upon a further investigation, we see that when Adam fell in the garden, it wasn't just that he as an individual chose to rebel, but that he plunged all of humanity into this wrong spirit, this spirit that is now operating in every person prior to coming to Christ. And if you look over with me in 1 John, toward the back of your Bible, 1 John chapter 4, he agrees. 1 John 4:4 says, "You are from God, little children, and have overcome them, because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world." So he very clearly is telling us there's a he in the believer, and that, interestingly enough, is a capital H, he, in my Bible at least, and then the lowercase h in the other he, the he that's in the world. So there's two he's talking about here. And then as we keep reading, verse 5 and 6, he says, "They are from the world, therefore they speak as from the world, and the world listens to them. We are from God. He who knows God listens to us. He who is not from God does not listen to us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error." So he's explaining to us that the capital H, he, is the spirit of truth. The lowercase h in the he of the world is the spirit of error. So we all come into this life joined to the spirit of error. Now, in John chapter 8, the Gospel of John, Jesus calls the devil the father of lies. And he tells a group of people he's talking to there, he says, "You're of your father, the devil, and his lust you are doing." So they were not even aware. See, I think all of us think we're just independent beings walking around out here doing our own thing. You know, you live your life, I'll live mine. I'll do what I want to do, you do what you want to do, and just stay away from me. We'll get along just fine. Well, that's not true, because we're all intimately connected, more than we even can imagine. We are all of one spirit or the other. We're all walking according to a lie, or we're all walking in the truth, one of the other, one or the other. So back in Galatians 2:20, he says, "I've been crucified with Christ." The I that has been crucified here is the I that is joined to sin. The I that is one with the spirit of error, the I that is walking according to the course of this world, the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that's in those that are disobedient. That I has to die. Well, we tend not to let that happen. We cling to our own independent self until we just simply can't cling any longer. That's been my experience in my own life, and what I've seen in others is that we have to really get beat up a lot, and we have to really try and fail for a long time, it seems, before we're willing to let go of the lie, this lie of independence. In Romans 6 and 7, the Apostle Paul illustrates this just magnificently. I mean, I would encourage you to look at those verses closer. I for one, believe that Galatians 2:20 is an encapsulation of what Paul is really teaching us in Romans 6, 7, and 8. It's an amazing compact verse here in Galatians 2:20. So in Romans 6, Paul says, "Don't you know that those of us that have been baptized into Christ have been baptized into his death?" So he's saying that on the cross, when Jesus was crucified and when he died, that God placed us in him. In Romans 5, the Bible clearly tells us that we all come into this life dead in sin in Adam, and that God's plan is to take us out of this death, darkness, and satanic kingdom and transfer us into the kingdom of his Son. Well, he does that by way of the cross, and Jesus himself, what Paul calls the last Adam, in his willingness, even though sinless, to go to the cross as me and as you. So what we do is we say, "God, I don't understand this at all. I don't see how I sinned in the garden, and I don't see how I died on that cross. But your word is telling me this, and I have to by faith say, you know what? God is God, and he's timeless, and he's spirit, and he's telling me the facts, and my understanding is very limited. So I have to say, okay, God, I'll take it. I'll take what you're saying, and I'll say, yes, I am crucified with Christ." That's what we do. We by faith say, "I am crucified with Christ." And what is crucified there is the satanic union, because mankind is never independent. It's never independent. It's never just Louie. It's never just me. It's always sin operating in me, and then it becomes Christ operating in me after I'm born again. It's a powerful message. So then he says in the next section, Galatians 2:20, he says, I've been crucified with Christ. And then he says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So now it's no longer this false, deceptive, independent I that's been running my life as the spirit of error, living my life. That's no longer the one in charge. He's no longer the one living my life. Now it's Christ himself, the anointed one in me, living. And it's not ever been an independent me, but it's definitely not an independent me now because it's Christ in me. I no longer live. Now, how can we back this up scripturally? Well, Jesus, God in the flesh, he fully identifies himself with his people, with his followers, with his believers. So, look back with me in Matthew 25. There's a question that comes up to Jesus about the judgment and what's coming. So he starts to explain things. Of course, he uses parables a lot, but he's talking about the king returning, or the king coming, and the king's going to separate the goats and the sheep and all of these kinds of things. Let's see. He says, when I was a stranger and you invited me in, naked and you clothed me. This is Matthew 25, 35, 36, right in there. So Jesus is saying, look, I came to you in all these various forms, naked, hungry, in prison, sick, all these kind of things, and you took care of me. So in verse 40, it says the king will answer, okay, let's see, verse 39, it says, when did we see you sick or in prison or come to you? See, the people, they don't get it. Verse 40, the king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. And then he goes on to tell you the reverse. When you didn't feed or clothe or visit, you didn't clothe or visit me. So he's completely 100% identifying with his people. So how we treat fellow Christians, fellow believers, is really how we're treating Christ himself. Why? Because just as Paul says in Galatians 2:20, he says, it's no longer I living, it's Christ now living. So this is a tough one because I'm just as guilty as everyone else looking at other Christians and thinking, what's going on with that? I'm sure people do that to me. They look at me and they go, what's going on with him? But we have to be careful with this because as a Christian, as a believer, a born-again person, it's not I living, it's Christ living. And if you're a born-again person, then it's no longer you living, it's Christ living. So when I'm bad-mouthing or mistreating or ignoring or neglecting you, according to these verses here in Matthew 25, I'm neglecting Christ himself. That changes things. But see, that's the eyes of faith. That's walking in the Spirit. We have to see each other differently, the way God says we are. So now look in Acts. You're in Matthew, just a little bit back to your right. Acts chapter 9, you'll see the story of the Apostle Paul when he had a transformation. His born-again experience is documented right here in Acts chapter 9. He's going by the name Saul, and he's going to lock up Christians, mistreat Jesus' people. So Jesus confronts him. So in Acts 9, verse 3, we're going to read 3 through 6, I think, here. As he was traveling, it happened that he was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And he says, get up and enter the city, and it will be told you what you must do. Wow. So Jesus says to Saul at this point, who becomes the Apostle Paul, he says, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. Well, Paul's like, I don't even know who you are. So what is he saying? He's saying, Paul or Saul, you're chasing down, you're mistreating, locking up, and having my people, my Christians, my followers and believers killed. And what you're doing is you're persecuting me. See, Jesus 100% identifies with his people. Why? Well, Paul goes on to see and understand that Christ is the head and we're his body. There it is. So now we no longer live, but Christ lives. All right, now look back in Colossians. You might want to keep your finger on Galatians 2:20 if you want to. But in Colossians, let's see, chapter 3, verse 3 and 4, look what this says. He says, "For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God." And then he says, "When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory." See, you died. That old independent father of lies, indwelt man died. And now Christ actually is your life. He's not a part of your life. He's not just his life and your life, two separate lives, but he is your life. 1 Corinthians 6:17 says, "He that's joined to the Lord is one spirit." There's no separation anymore. So Galatians 2:20, he says, "It's no longer I who live, but it's Christ living in me." And then he says, "The life which I now live, wow, in the flesh." See, he still has a physical body and he still has an earthly life to navigate. "The life which I now live in the flesh." So how does the Christian's life work? How does it look living in the flesh? Well, I think the best example, you guessed it, Jesus. Look back in the Gospel of John. I'm going to go through several verses here. We're going to start in John 5, and we're going to go through John 14, but we're going to just pick out some verses along the way. And this is going to show us how Jesus lived his earthly life in his flesh body. And this is exactly what we do. A lot of people think, well, what would Jesus do? And they think, well, let's find out what Jesus would do and let's imitate him. Well, that is true, I've discovered, but it's not because, he took mud and put on a blind man's eyes, or he told someone to wash and told someone to say, not those things, but we imitate how he operated his life 24/7. And I think it might surprise some of you. He operates from a place of no independence. He operates from a place of really recognizing that as a human being, he's powerless. And so that's what we're going to look at. John 5, verse 19, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself." There it is. See, Jesus knew that he was not independent of his Father, unless it is something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner. See, Jesus is a perfect, physical, human expression of the invisible God. That's what we find out in Colossians. So, John 5:30, he says again, "I can do nothing on my own initiative." I love these verses. It gives your humanity a break. It allows you to just be a human being and recognize that being human is a great and wonderful thing, but it's also a powerless position because it's the Spirit of God in you. It's the life of Christ in you that is really the only one and the only way to accomplish what God has for us. John 6, verse 57, Jesus speaking again, "As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who eats me, he also will live because of me." So Jesus is saying, look, I live from the Father, and I'm going to offer you myself so that you will live from me. So he's the connection back to the Father. Humans becoming one with God again. That's the life of the Christian. John 8, verse 42. Jesus says, "If God were your Father, you would love me. For I proceeded forth and have come from God. For I have not even come on my own initiative, but he sent me." It wasn't Jesus' plan. It was the Father's plan. He said, "Go, son. This is what we're going to do." John 12, verse 49. Jesus again, "For I did not speak on my own initiative, but the Father himself who sent me has given me a commandment as to what to say and what to speak." There it is. And this is my favorite one, John 14:10. Jesus says, "Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me?" The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own initiative, but the Father abiding in me does his works. So Jesus is saying, you can know that the Father is in me because of the outward result. What you see happening is evidence and proof that the Father is abiding in me. But I love how he says this. He says, the Father abiding in me does his works. Whew. So in that sense, Jesus as a human being is saying, look, the works you see me doing are not really me doing them. It's not that the Father gives me works and then I do them. It's the Father in me and he does his own works, but he's doing it as me. That's what Jesus taught, and that's how he lived. And the Apostle Paul, after Jesus revealed himself to him in Acts chapter 9, the Apostle Paul's light came on, and all of a sudden God reordered his thinking and his education and his understanding because the Apostle Paul had received this very Christ to dwell within him. And that's what being born again means. That's what being a Christian is. It's not about trying harder. It's not about me doing better. It's not about me at all. So Galatians 2:20 again, let's look back at it again. The last part, he says, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. Now, this Bible translation says, I live by faith in the Son of God. The King James, and I prefer this in this instance, you can have your own preference, but I think the King James is a little closer. He says, I live by the faith of the Son of God. It's not just Paul's faith in the Son of God, but it's really Paul's faith in the Son of God's faithfulness. It's his faithfulness in me that I live by. Wow. So, a few more verses and we're about to wrap this thing up. 2 Corinthians, let's go to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15:10. Look what Paul says here. He says, but by the grace of God I am what I am. And his grace toward me did not prove vain. But I labored even more than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God with me. So Paul's saying, look, I work really hard, but then he qualifies that and makes his point that underneath it, it's really not I. It's the grace of God that's been in my life. And through that grace, God himself is manifest. So, 2 Corinthians now, chapter 1, verse 9. I love this verse. To me, this is the meaning of life. This is the answer to the problem. 2 Corinthians 1:9, Paul says, indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. We had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. Man, there it is. He says, I labored, but it wasn't really me. It was the grace of God with me. And in 2 Corinthians 1:9, he said, the trouble we're having, the sentence of death, the shipwreck, the starving, the mistreatment, the beatings, the imprisonment, the misunderstandings, the abuse that we take as believers carrying out the Great Commission is part of the plan, because it teaches us over and over again not to trust in ourselves, not to trust in this lie of independence, not to trust that the human in and of itself has any ability whatsoever. See, Jesus modeled that for us. He showed us that. So all the I's in the Galatians 2:20 verse have been covered. Now let me finish with one more verse. Galatians 2:21. He says, I do not nullify the grace of God. The King James says, I do not frustrate the grace of God. For if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly. I do not frustrate the grace of God. That would mean that I'm in here trying to operate as though I'm independent, trying to do better, do good, obey laws, make myself a better Christian, a better person, improve myself. No, God's plan is not self-improvement. God's plan is that you, the old you, the independent I, the spirit of error indwelt you, that came on the scene because of Adam's fall in the beginning, that I can't be improved, and God has no plan to improve that I. His plan is to crucify that I, and that's exactly what he's done. And our side of the equation is to say, you know what? That has died. There's no improving the old dead guy. No, we just bury him. And then we walk by faith, in faith, with the Son of God, and we've become one with him. We have been crucified with Christ. We no longer live. And the life we now live is really Christ living this life that you see. It's really Christ in me, the hope of glory. Christ in you, the hope of glory. It's the mystery that's been revealed. I hope this has found you well today, and if it has, I pray that you would share it with others, and that we would all come to see the greater revelation that the gospel isn't just that Jesus died and shed his blood to forgive you of your sins. The gospel is you have died too, and you have been buried, and you have been raised to walk in newness of life, one with Christ, like God's plan has always been, and it's back on track, ready to go as soon as you just take it by faith. Thanks for watching today. I'll see you on the next Louie File.